Welcome, everyone. I'm Phyllis Klein, and this is Poets in Conversation. Tonight we have Richard Cole, who's the winner of the Grayson Book Poetry Prize in 2021, and Ginny Connors, who's the publisher of Grayson Books, whose latest book, Without Goodbyes, came out this year. We'll be hearing from two passionate authors about two very different subjects: poetry about the world of business and its intersections with the spiritual, and a historical story of a kidnapping in the early 1700s that led a real Puritan girl, Joanna Kellogg, into her life as an adoptee, White Feather, into a Native American tribe in Quebec and the book is for young adult and adult readers. So as you can hear, those are two very different books. But what they have in common is the way they ponder what makes human life both arduous and luminous. That's my take on it anyway. And we can talk about what we all think about that. So it's truly my great pleasure to welcome Richard and Ginny. Thank you so much for being here, for doing this, and thanks everybody for coming too. I brought a couple of poems, one to open and one to close. And I was trying to think, well, what am I going to read about? And it occurred to me that I had this poem that is about a story. So I thought that might fit in with Ginny's book. And it's about a historical character. She wasn't real, though. But at the end of the poem, I'll tell you, if you haven't guessed who it is, I'll tell you. And the title is called The Story I Didn't Tell. When I married you, 1,000 of your wives' corpses covered my path to the altar. My father tried to dissuade me. I only wanted to save those remaining and put an end to your vengeance if I could. In private, I'll admit I cringe from your tainted touch, your criminal mind. My 1,000 sisters murdered to avenge your one cheating wife. My dreams overflow with them when I sleep at all. That's how my 1,001 stories help us both, distract us from your cruelty and violence. In the book about me, I am not afraid, but don't believe it. How have I done this night after night? Thought up the genies, the gins, the wandering mysteries like water drops forming a lake, forming an ocean, keeping me alive another day and then another. Don't be sad for me. I have used my mind for peace. I have done what I could in a disaster. I have traveled in secret. I have altered the veil of bedtime forever. And that's Scheherazade. Thank you. So let me introduce now Richard Cole. Richard Cole is the author of 3 books of poetry: Song of the Middle Manager, Grayson Books, which is what we'll be hearing from tonight; The Glass Children, University of Georgia Press; and Success Stories, Limestone Books. He is also the author of a memoir, Catholic by Choice, which is published by Loyola Press. His poems and essays have appeared in numerous publications and anthologies. Honors include an NEA fellowship and several writing grants. In addition, Cole has worked as a copywriter in New York, served as a communications manager in 4 software startups, edited 2 trade journals, and now runs a business writing agency in Austin, Texas. And his wife works as a psychic counselor, helping clients with death and dying issues. And you can find out more at his website, richard-cole.net. So we're going to hear a lot about work. And I'm so excited to introduce Richard. Welcome. It's my pleasure to have you.
Happy to be here. Okay, thank you everyone for being here. A couple of days ago, I was talking with Ginny and Phyllis and quoted Thomas Tranströmer, a wonderful, wonderful Swedish poet, won the Nobel a while back. And his idea of a poem is where people meet. It's a meeting place. We come together and, we share various things. So welcome to our, our virtual square, our virtual meeting place. So as Phyllis said, this is a book about work and the human spirit. It's about money and also the larger understanding that we might have about money. There's a definition that states the divine, that God is invisible but apparent everywhere. And I always thought that was a good definition of money. It's invisible, but it's apparent everywhere. It's all around us, and it sort of keeps us apart, and it also brings us together. So the first poem that I'll read is The Beauty of a Strip Mall. When I was growing up, my dad never had a job, ever. He never had any job in his entire life. He always had a business, small businesses that eventually became larger. And one of my earliest childhood memories is in the car with him in Crum, Texas. Yeah, there is a Crum, Texas. And he's talking about the businesses. We're driving down, and well, that gas station over there, and he owned a gas station, might not do so well, the traffic patterns and so forth and other, and that pharmacy, that shoe store and so forth and other. So it from the get-go, it gave me an understanding that businesses don't just drop out of the sky, that they all represent people and aspirations. And they're sometimes overlooked, but still, that's not necessarily the way things should be. I've always thought about that line in Death of a Salesman. Linda Lohman, wife of Willie Lohman, at his funeral, she's saying attention must be paid to this man. And a lot of things that I've been doing as a writer, as a poet for many decades is to try to pay attention to things that are often overlooked. So this first poem addresses that sort of ambition to pay attention to things that are often overlooked and often precarious. The beauty of a strip mall is the beauty of a minor dream turned quietly aside at the end of the day. The beauty of the small, impossible ledgers recording hope against subtraction and finally closed with a sigh. Every unremarkable donut shop is somebody's act of faith, and somewhere between almost and never quite, in the last miles of aging neon and plastic backlit signage, here too is poetry, where the books will someday be balanced, and the future is always a bargain. Everything 99 cents. I love those little strip malls. They're so dear. These little lives behind those neon signs. So over the years, like virtually everybody else who writes poetry, I've been tussling with the thoughts about how to do that and pay the bills, with the exception of James Merrill, of course, who grew up rich and, to his credit, did not waste his life playing tennis and drinking champagne in the afternoon. But the most of us, we've got to make that decision. How do we do this thing, poetry, which basically, in and of itself, really doesn't earn any money at all, and at the same time, pay our mortgages, pay our bills, and so forth and other. This poem, "Song of the Middle Manager," the title poem of the book, um, talks about a moment. It was a Monday morning. I was walking into a office building where I walked, or where I worked at the time, and I just looked around, and we were all showing up. People in their business suits and moving up and down the stairs and so forth and other. And I had this little moment of quiet pride. It's too easy to demonize the jobs that take us away from the things that are closest to our heart. That's very, very human. But I thought there would be an advantage in talking about that sort of quiet pride that we can have when we're in the office and doing the things that we have to do. So that's the genesis of that this poem here. Song of the Middle Manager. I have walked down silent corporate hallways deep in the belly. I have worn the white shirts of fire with muted tie, dark shoes, and matching wallet. I have eaten the cocktail weenie at company picnics and listened to the bosses and admired their muscular toys. I have laughed with the eager lieutenants. I have kissed ass and pondered. I have watched over my unwavering people and watched them disappear into void. I have cleaned out my desk. I have felt a company go under. I have passed through the walls of yellow smoke and emerged, squinting on the other side, and consulted with the prophets of caffeine charting apocalypse, who will be saved and who will be marked as losers. I have lost my dreams in exchange for others smaller and stronger. I have caught the last flight out of Omaha. I have made my connections. And at times, alone in the early morning, somewhere between the parking lot and divided office, between the checks and daily inches of accommodation, I have seen such beauty in the air and paused, if only for a moment. I have gone so far and not gone further. I have walked through other doorways filled with light. Small triumphs. Initial public offering. Um, I'm assuming most of you know about IPOs and how that's the holy grail of a lot of startups. If you can have an initial public offering of stock, then you're opening yourself to the possibility of a lot of money flooding into your company. There are a lot of challenges. I've never been in a startup that actually had an IPO, but I've certainly been in startups where that was what we were marching toward. And I know other people who've gone through this. This is an interesting poem. Some of it's in prose and some of it's in poetry. And if you don't have the book in front of you, of course, you don't know the difference. Maybe there isn't. Maybe that's sort of the point, because being in the business world and working in poetry is, in a way, working in both poetry and prose. So let's see if the difference is audible. Initial public offering. Monitors at dawn. In our cubicles, we stare at the estimated earnings. An hour ahead, the New York market is preparing to open, and we all lean forward. This is our baby offering. Dear God, make it happen. The ticker starts crawling across the bottom of the screen. Our stock opens, and the price declines, unsteady. Then it gains $2. The floor trembles. For a moment, the market ponders, watching itself. The stock ticks, 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 then ticks up $5, 8, then 12, and surging now, building traction, and we all take a breath, and everyone is suddenly talking, and like a miracle, on the roof of our office building, bright sails flare open and belly tight in the wind, and our building lurches. We feel it start to move, grinding forward with every window shaking, market numbers climbing, and we're cheering now. And the building gathers speed, scraping over the lawns of the office park, leaving a trail of raw earth and tiny figures in the parking lot. And our building severs the freeway, cars screeching, slamming into each other as we pass like a grand hallucination, like a dinosaur crushing the bridges, red lights flashing, dragging power lines behind us, sparking like wild nerves. And then suddenly it's silent. We're in the air. We're flying. The CEO clears his throat. His eyes glitter kindly as he stirs his coffee and gets up to speak. $1 billion per year, he says. A hush fills the room. Our eyes shine like his, our minds racing as we calculate our options. And he talks and talks us higher, our knight of faith, dream weaver, and the stock keeps gaining confidence, and we're sailing faster, staring in wonder as we fly toward a wall of clouds, beautiful clouds, massive and brilliant like solid rock. Imagine seeing that in the windshield. So surreal. That's that's one of the things that an experience that I've had oftentimes in the business world. Is this real? Is this happening? Honestly, a lot of these poems are about success, and of course, that's the title of my second book, Success Stories. When I went to New York with my wife, and we were going to be a success, so it's ironic, but very, very American. America's where you have to make things. So like the etymology of the word poetry, something made, as opposed to, I guess, conversational speech, but it's something made. And in America, we are obliged to make things. And at the same time, what is the cost of that? At this point, uh, I think we all have our favorite billionaires. I have mine. People who have, obviously made something. Are they fully realized human beings? I don't know. Financial consultant once said to his about his clients, and he dealt with very wealthy people. He said nobody survives 1 billion. And so, looking at the news these days, I think about that. Our Elons and our Jeffs and so forth and other, have they survived 1 billion? This is called triage. And it talks about the sort of trade-off, the back and forth. It's a very complicated balancing act that we all have as we go through our lives. Triage. Yes, There are days when the ER doors explode and cold code blue comes in on a gurney. Excuse me, stumbling with my mouse. Do it again. Okay, reset. Triage. Yes, there are days when the ER doors explode and code blue comes in on a gurney, rapid crosstalk over the patients, one right after the other. More often, though, we triage our lives with quiet, glancing deferments of care, attention, faith, for whatever needs us and cannot be ignored or left to die. We have no choice but to choose among these three: money, the people we love, and our inner life, such as it is. We can save the one, maybe two out of three. Nobody has it all. The math doesn't work that way. The one might serve the other, the church of parenthood, perhaps, or creativity that pays the bills. But marriages can fail in the face of sudden money. We can fall in love as our business fades, or drive down avenues of achievement, proud and blind. We can die before we die. We can hold our breath for years and do. Our dreams growing beautiful as autumn leaves, golden and forgotten. Still, we can find what feeds us in triage, an ascending crisis of opportunities, thinking like nurses and ER doctors, fast and wise as much as possible, trying to live one life as we save others. One of the things that I did for years was attend an energy conference, big oil and gas companies. And you might have read about, in varying degrees, about the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe, that offshore platform, drilling platform in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, where it blew up. And so I thought about that a lot. I thought about this poem for a lot, for about 10 years. And it finally came together. And I thought about the connections and how evocative that title was, Deepwater Horizon. So here we go. Deepwater Horizon. As if by torchlight, I remember the years I went down to the energy capital of the world to write for clients in oil and gas, to follow great engines of commerce, tax regimes, and the audits floating on oceans of credit. I remember the semi-retired world leaders showing up in the lobbies, flanked by vigilance, billionaires on the jumbotrons. It was that kind of world, impressive, strange, dead serious, but somehow made up and embraced because it worked. I would file my stories of who said what and where we're going, and in the evening I would walk to dinner past luxury gallerias, looking up at the office towers. They seemed to float like mountains, filled with light, so clean, empty, and quiet. On the third day, we re-emerged, blinking in sunlight, sharing cabs to the airport, but I would linger for an afternoon to look at art nearby, treasures in a museum built with oil, the $1 million abstractions, sepulchres, one lonely masterpiece, and always the dim chapel next door where I would sit in peace with the huge, transcendent paintings, so dark, and yet with an unexpected hope, as if at the end of the world. That was my job, to explain how some things work and what they cost. So let me remember the long drive home at night, thinking, as we might do when we drive through the dark, how all our computers run on fire, terminals linked to the server farms burning, with algorithms cooled by the rain, smartphones embedded with beads of blood, the networks alive in a cloud of lightning charged by the power of crude. And let me remember, as if by torchlight, the offshore rig, the flash and explosion, steel groaning as the burning platform drops to its knees, mercy boats circling helpless, and the columns of fire ascending in darkness, images Shakespearean in grandeur, bodies of angels floating in water. A kind of dark, glorious aspect to some of these things. So, I mentioned the etymology of poetry, the Greek one, you make something. Um, Lately, I was reading some translations of a couple of Chinese poets, and the translator talked about the etymology of poetry in ancient Chinese. And he says it was made up of two ideograms. Um, One, spoken word. Okay, that makes sense. And the other, it was originally a word that meant earth altar, an altar connected, centered on the earth. And that changed over the centuries into the word for temple, and then finally the word for monastery and the sacred space where rituals are performed in a monastery, like a Catholic mass, something spoken. So I thought that's even more interesting because it talks about poetry as being innately sacred in a way. And that's been part of the intentions of this book to, as I was saying, how we're in the world, but we're not of it. And yet we are in the world. And I like the idea of admission, one, a way to get into something, admission tickets, and the other idea of admission as almost a kind of confession. Admission. Perhaps in heaven the blind will still be blind, the lame won't walk, the deformed will not be otherwise, and it won't make a difference, not a bit. Perhaps all of heaven is just 2 inches away, the earth made truly in the image of heaven. Hard to say. If it's heaven all the way to heaven, then it might be hell all the way to hell. We see glimpses in the eyes of the patient dead walking among us. So too, in a heaven filled with children already here. Somehow, this is it. We have all arrived. A dazzling, infinite world packed neatly inside our capacities. If only we could see with both eyes open what we see with both eyes closed, and perhaps we always have. We're here. We made it.
So Richard,
Yeah.
wow, it's amazing. I wish we had time. I think we have time for one more.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I know you had some other ones that
No,
I
no.
hate to.
No, I time these things, but I also know when I get in front of an audience, I tend to go long.
Oh no, no.
That's
It's
just in the
yeah.
nature. I
No,
will, yeah.
it's wonderful. So I was trying to
Oh,
think which one would I want to hear, but why don't you pick one
I
more?
have appropriately, I'd like to end with the last poem in the book.
Yeah, I love that one. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. Thank you.
yeah. And this is called How Much Does Your House Weigh? Somewhere in the middle of marriage, we did the math. 200 pounds per square foot times 2,900 square feet. That's 580,000 pounds, 300 tons almost we carried on wings. For 20 years, the rooms were filled with children, noisy, unmindful about the future as was their right. We gave them memories. And you fill the backyard with roses, antiques from abandoned cemeteries, bred to survive alone. Heaven on Earth, Rev Door, Belinda's Dream, and a marriage bed of icebergs, white and burgundy. We raise the boys in the middle class of expectations. I taught them to fly, wobbly on their bicycles, how to drive, how to leave home someday, while you would show them how to stay in love. This was our calling, the art of effacement, except for the home you made and the house I strained to support, and under it all a thin insinuation of debt corrupting our slab foundation. This debt is a cancer, you said, and you were right. I made a mistake when I married you, and your mistake was to marry me. We did the math, and we're both bad at numbers. But what counts more, planting a tree or writing a poem? Writing a book or raising a child? Somehow the boys grew up and away, now fine young men, and now we carry half the weight with a smaller house, though even that might be too much. Tonight, I see us in a Liberty Bell, a bomber from World War II, coming back from a night raid. I'm not a pilot, but I'm flying this thing. Your hand on mine as my hand rests on the throttle. We've taken hits, the plane bucks and shivers, air whistling through the cabin, smoke trailing from one of the engines almost out of fuel, on a glide path downward across the divided channel, your hand on mine, the both of us still working, pressing to reach some green, imaginary, and ultimate England.
Mm.
So thank
Oh, thank you, Richard. Oh, everybody's
you.
ecstatic, I can see.
Little emojis going there.
Yeah, really. Oh, wow. Um, Gosh, well, Ginny, why don't you join me and Richard, and we'll have a little interlude. And there's a lot of comments in the chat. So let me start with a couple of those. So Perry says, so exciting the language you bring to the drabness of business. I was flying with you and I don't know about what. I really, but you're driving rhythm. And then Aaron says, these are the questions of our times. What an amazing subject about which to write poetry. Let's see.
Thank you both.
And Yeah, I think we can think about what it would be like to write about work, but when you bring it to life, it's just so wonderful to listen to, and so evocative and kind of familiar, because most of us here have had to work or wanted to work. And so I just love your writing about this. And yeah, maybe you could tell us. I think you mentioned a little bit about why you chose to write about work. Is there anything more you want to say about that?
Well, my first book was written in a kind of writer's paradise in Minneapolis, and I was a young man, single, tiny, tiny little apartment. And I could live on pennies a day. And every now and then I would get a writing grant or something, and so I'd be able to kind of squeak along, uh, working only part time. And then I met my wonderful wife. We went to New York. It is not cheap to live in New York, and all of a sudden, bang! I I had to be working full time. And fortunately, I got a job on Madison Avenue writing brochures for IBM. But I thought, no way in the world I can do that and start on another book. So I basically just thought, well, I've had it. I'm washed up. Yeah, thought that for about 2 years, and then slowly wallowing in self-pity and frustration and so forth and other, as creatives often do, part of the job profile. Um, I realized that the problem itself could be a very good topic. So I began to write about that, the tension between the two sides of my life. And that just continued. And we had kids and, moved away from New York and raised the boys and so forth and other, but it was always a theme. So I thought, well, embrace the conflict, embrace the theme. You'll always have something to write about because you'll probably never make enough money. And so this is going to be a lifetime issue, uh, a creative tension. So it's turned into a blessing.
I don't think you're just writing about work. I think you're writing about life, and you're using work as your vehicle, but your themes of how we balance the need to support ourselves financially, like you said, we might not see money, but it's all around us and we need it. And what we can give to the people in our lives, and our need for some kind of inner life too, that affects everybody. And you bring it to life so well with these poems that relate to the work life, but get the tensions in there. And I think you present them so well, and your imagery is so memorable. So I just think it's a wonderful topic. And yeah, I think you've cornered the market here. I know that David White used to be hired by some corporations, I think, to present poetry or poetry workshops for corporations. But I don't know too many people who have written the way you do about work. And it's just wonderfully done. And you presented so well tonight. I like the way you set up your poems and talked about them. That was very helpful. One of my
it's a theme
my
that
privileges as being a publisher, very small publisher, is that I get to interact with so many poets who are much better than I am, but I get to read their stuff and talk to them and be involved with them, and it's just been terrific. And that includes Phyllis. I don't know if all of you know about Phyllis's book that Grayson Books published called The Full Moon Herald. She had a very original approach. It was Ezra Pound, I think, who said, the news that stays news is poetry is the news that stays news. And she actually formatted her book rather like a newspaper with different sections, like the sections of a newspaper, and her poems are all very timely. So you should put in the, oh yeah, you've got it in the chat. You can get a hold of that book. It's a really wonderful book.
Oh, thank you.
But Richard, I just love your work. Phrases like hope against subtraction, which is in the first one you read, that seems to me to sum up life. We go forward, we have our hopes, but then there's a process of subtraction as we get older. And I just think that describes so much that people go through. And I like your ability to focus on something that we pass by every day and ignore, like the strip mall, and see in it somebody's act of faith, which of course all of those businesses are. So that's just wonderful. I'm interested in how many of your poems have kind of a static or biblical feel to them. For instance, the Song of the Middle Manager just seems like the biblical tribulations that a person goes through. And you drop in words like white shirts of fire, prophets and apocalypse. And there are angels in that one too. If not in that one, it's in another one. Doorways filled with light. That particular poem, I was very interested in the last line. You talk about all you've gone through, and then you say, I've gone so far and not gone further. I've walked through other doorways filled with light. And I was a little curious about those other doorways. Want to comment on that?
Well, as I'm a painter, and that's one of them back there, it did a series of portals. And somebody once asked me, well, what are they portals to? And I thought about that and I thought, well, to the greater reality that enfolds us. So I didn't want to just leave it at saying I've done so much and no more. I
Right.
wanted to have this final image of him, I don't know, some light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
That voice, he is not just staying at that next to last line. There's something, there's an opening outward. And the irony, I showed it to Bill Levine once, and he crossed out the last line.
Uh-oh.
And I thought, Bill, you're kind of like missing the point there, but fine, you know.
Well,
That's been known
bring
to
the
happen.
spiritual realm into your poetry, and that last line, I think, represents that.
Yeah,
But
that's
it's a little mysterious. It's the kind of last line that you dwell on.
Yeah. Well, we were. I have this quote in front of me. Thomas Keating, a Trappist monk, contemplative, is a leader in a path that I follow, Catholic contemplative. And in one of his books, I love this quote here. He says, "The spiritual journey is not a career or a success story. It is a series of humiliations of the false self that become more and more profound.
Mm.
These make room inside us for the Holy Spirit to come and heal." And I just love that. And again, I think of the billionaires of our world. I'm thinking, well, you're having an interesting success story. How's that going to work out ultimately?
Yeah.
Nobody knows. But I love the fact that he's saying it's not a success story.
Yeah. What's your
Teachers.
idea of success? Is it
Well, yeah. So
muscular toys that you've admired?
speaking of success, yeah, I want to introduce you, Ginny, and talk about what an amazing publisher you are without embarrassing you. So I won't gush, okay? But thank you, Richard. It's fabulous reading, and we're going to come back to talk more. And yeah, so I'll leave it there. I just want to, yeah, maybe I'll just say, that book is my first book, and I didn't really know anything about getting a book published. And I just was really, I had beginner's luck. That's all I can say. Just getting to have you as my publisher. And I'm sure that most everyone who goes through Grace and has that same feeling. So let me introduce you. Ginny Lowe Connors is the author of 4 full-length poetry collections. And she's also really modest, in case you hadn't noticed that, including her latest book, Without Goodbyes, From Puritan Deerfield to Mohawk Kanawaki. I hope I'm saying that right. Her chapbook, Under the Porch, won the Sunken Garden Poetry Prize. And she has earned numerous awards for individual poems. She is co-editor of the Connecticut River Review and runs a small poetry press, a small and venerated poetry press, Grayson Books. About her book, Without Goodbye, she says, I think the best way to come to an understanding of history is to imagine the thoughts and feelings of those directly involved. This book focuses on real historical events, while I write to imagine the emotional truths of the characters, and we'll be hearing a lot more about that. Ginny resides in West Hartford, Connecticut, close to the homes of Mark Twain, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Wallace Stevens, and is pleased to find herself living among the ghosts of these literary giants. So let's hear about Joanna Kellogg, Ginny.
Hey, thank you, Phyllis. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I'll give a little background to the story of Without Goodbyes. It is a narrative collection. And as Phyllis said, is based on a real historical incident that's fairly well known. It's the story of Joanna Kellogg, who was an 11-year-old Puritan girl living in Deerfield, Massachusetts in the very early 1700s. And she, along with many others, was captured in a raid on that village, a big raid. She and 2 of her siblings, Joseph and Rebecca, were taken to Kanawaki, which was a Mohawk village in New France, which is what Canada was called at that time, pretty near Montreal. And that village also included a Jesuit mission. Joanna, I'm going to cough a couple of times, getting over the flu. Joanna was adopted into a Mohawk family, and she lived there for most of the rest of her life. So her introduction to the First Nations people was very traumatic. But over time, she truly became part of the Mohawk community. I want to let you know that in the opening poem of the book, which I'm going to read, there's the word savage, which is an offensive term, but it is certainly how Joanna viewed the First Nations people during that raid and for a while afterwards. She was terrified, but later they became her loved ones. 300 years later, people still struggle with concepts of us versus them. But when people come into intimate contact with each other, those artificial boundaries often dissolve. And I think that's one reason that Joanna's story is still relevant. You think of our country, it's a nation of people descended from Native Americans, slaves, immigrants from way back until recently, people who came in servitude. We've all kind of made it work together, but not without a lot of trials and tribulations. So in the book Without Goodbyes, I tell Joanna's story. I did a fair amount of research, but there's a lot that I don't know. And so it's like kind of like a historical novel. It's a lot of imagination in there too. That is how I come to understand history, is to imagine what it's like for the people involved. So the first poem I'm going to read takes place in Deerfield Village, February 29th, 1704. That was a winter of very heavy snow. And though Deerfield was surrounded by a palisade fence, when the raiders came, and they were mostly Mohawks, but also some French soldiers, They were able to climb up the snowbanks and easily get into the village. This poem is called Everything She Knows Goes Up in Smoke. The night before, her hands chapped and stupid, Joanna dropped a redware pitcher, watched it shatter, her mother's flare of anger, sudden sting of a slap, her father's pinched lips. And now, this broken morning, how red the rising sun. The air so cold, already her heart is freezing. The wind shrieks, and a pig, too, galloping past them, a hatchet in its side, a savage chasing after it, and a French soldier laughing like the very devil. Blood on the snow, bodies, mash of footprints everywhere. A woman's, excuse me, a woman's shawl whipping in the wind, some crippled thing trying to fly. Flames roaring, consuming their homes, thick hurdles of smoke. Its acrid smell mixes with the odor of blood, old sweat. Can this be real? Survivors herded toward the meeting house, she among them. The men are roped like plates. Raiders strut, push, shout in words she doesn't know, hauling away woolens, kettles, bread and bacon, and prisoners, 100 Deerfield villagers, many of them children like Joanna. Reverend Williams, their leading citizen, moves meekly along, his eyes tearing, lips sputtering. She tries not to cry, but cinders lodge in her eye. Crows flap and hop among the slaughtered, repeating, "Ack, ack, ack." Joanna pulls her sister along, but turns to look back and sees a figure in nightclothes fleeing toward the woods. Her mother, abandoning them. The journey they took go up to New France, into the village of Ganawaki. It was about 300 miles through wilderness. And at first they had to go very quickly because the raiders were worried about getting caught or being chased. The next poem takes place during that journey and is called A Coating of Ice. They slept in shelters made of log poles and skins as freezing rain clinked against the hides. But today, the sun is a bright coin tossed high and far. All the trees wear an armor of ice. Joanna blinks, half blind in all this light. Her thoughts are heavy and black. Though today the whole world shines, it stretches out before her. Trees and snow, ice glitter, questions without answer, an emptiness coated in ice. She is no place. She is no one. Joanna Kellogg of Deerfield, brown-haired girl whose home had a fine red door, whose mother taught her the things a girl must know, whose father hummed and worked his fields, brought her outside to smell the turned soil, measure the height of their corn. That girl's lost as a dream at dawn. And her chickens with their warm eggs, they're a story one tells little children. She's been given a new name, Onikanos Ayote. Joseph, who talks to Indians as if he's forgotten, he's a white boy with a civilized tongue. Joseph says he thinks the name means white feather. What kind of fool name is that? Onikanos Ayote? No. That girl, Joanna? No. She is a stomach clenching. They have run out of food. Sorry, my voice isn't quite up to par here, but I'm doing the best I can. The next poem is several days into their journey and is called They See a White Owl. Snow turns to slush. They keep going. Joseph, who used to run back and forth, talking, pointing, strutting, he's slowed down. Rivers to cross, mountains to climb, keep going. At dusk, a snowy owl glides overhead, a vision, a ghost, a spirit leading them on. They all pause, gaze upward. Something shifts inside Joanna. To be in this wild place with the wind carrying its pine scent, the moon rising, all notion of chores erased, it's not entirely bad. But the meat of 2 rabbits and a handful of beans make a thin stew. Children are given their portions first, but never enough. As darkness settles over them, Becca huddles against her sister, and Joanna feels the jut of her small shoulder blades, sharp as plow blades. Joanna and her sister are girls dressed in rags who must stumble through a wilderness. If they could fly above it all, wearing white feathers, but no. A red star throbs on the horizon, and the night feels large around them. The next poem is called The Rapids, and the name of the village where they landed, Ganawaki, is Mohawk, or Place of the Rapids, and is located on the St. Lawrence River, near a place where there's a pretty strong cascade. Joanna, at this point, is referred to as White Feather. She's been in the community for a while. The Rapids. On her stomach, beneath a curtain of willow leaves, White Feather gazes toward the rapids, where the river rowdies to a noisy white froth. Water rushes over and through this cascade. No thought of danger. Sunlight falling toward it breaks into a million glittering sparks, becoming small flames that ride the water. Ganawaki men know to portage their canoes around this part of the river. Trappers and traders hire them to do the same. But sometimes in a journey, the rapids come on unexpected. She knows this. You have to plunge through and hope to make it. Past the boulders and the churning, though you don't know up from down, water from air, or where this perilous ride will take you. Throughout the story, Joanna gradually is acclimating to being part of this community in Ganawaki, but it's a process. This poem is called Instruction. Forget the spinning wheel. Forget the heckling of flax. Forget the plank table you scrubbed each day, the wood grain glowing beneath your touch. The youngest boy and what was done to him, that you must forget. Your mother's back as she ran into the trees, holding her nightdress close. Forget, forget, forget. And your father's shuffling silence, his face blank, his eyes refusing to see you anymore. It's something to forget. Here, the men are bold, and the women rule, open-hearted in their laughter. They hold out their arms to the young, carry their babies everywhere, strapped safely into cradle boards. There is almost no crying. There is no need for crying. The old prayers you were warned never to forget got lost on their way toward heaven or fell to the frozen earth. Words become smoke, promises turn to ash. Forget all the old names, except your own. Remember Joanna. You are not that girl anymore, but you carry her with you. A person is made of skin and bones, hunger and hope, footprints and many ghosts. Come quietly to your ghosts, Joanna. Allow them to rest. Joanna was in Ganawaki with her sister and brother. Her father and older step brother were taken elsewhere. And eventually they were redeemed, or they were, a ransom was paid for them. But Joanna and her brother and sister were adopted and gradually became very happy in their community at Ganawaki. Joanna's not quite there yet, but her sister is getting closer to that in this poem called Her Sister Swimming. Becca, little bird she's called now, has learned to swim. White Feather watches the Ganawaki girls, Moonface, Twig, and Gray Dawn splash her, encourage her, laugh with her. Tiny rainbows as drops go flying. Little bird emerges from the river, sleek and smiling. Stands in shadow, laughs at her almost daughter, who's learned this new thing, who's joined the other girls. Stands in shadow is so easy with the child. Doesn't scold when little bird runs to her, carelessly soaking her skirt. Little bird clutches moments of happiness, greedy for them. The way she gulped down mouthfuls of stew when they first arrived. Hunger, the only sure thing. White Feather should be glad for her little sister who can laugh again after all. But a meanness rises up sometimes, bile in her throat. It chokes her, like smoke from wood that's green or damp. Foolish girl, sometimes White Feather wants to shake her. These people tore apart our lives. How do we forgive that? White Feather presses her lips together, says nothing. Her sister's cheeks have filled out again. The purple shadows beneath her eyes are gone. And today, the cool breeze off the river feels delicious. A gull shrieks, then repeats itself 3 times. The girls in the river shout their fun, screech, shout again. Now the gull hangs in the air, and White Feather, too, feels suspended, watching, listening, a little apart from all the rest. She's suspicious of happiness, the way it sneaks up unnoticed, the way it threatens sometimes to carry her away too. I'll just read one more. A little background on this one. Excuse me. Most of the Ganawaki Mohawks were nominally Catholic. There was that Jesuit mission on the in the village, and that is still there, by the way. But they still continued to follow their native spiritual practices. It's kind of a combination. There's also a mention in this poem of a miracle that saved Joanna's brother when he was near death during a smallpox epidemic. And that is an interesting part of recorded history that really happened. There's other poems about that in this book. This poem is called 3 Kinds of Religion. And again, it's from Joanna's perspective. When White Feather was a white girl, a Puritan girl, religion was one man thundering warnings, urging watchfulness. It was devils and witches and wicked ways that can grab a person up if she's not careful. It was a single God, frightening God, a male God, and it was reading scriptures, saying prayers, and obeying always obeying the rules men say were spoke by God. When she's in the mission church, religion is called Catholic, and it is people singing. It's light through the windows, and some words in a language called Latin. It's angels and a God who has a son who was also a God, and a ghost is in there somewhere. It's confessing bad thoughts and saying Hail Marys and looking at the cross so as to remember suffering is goodness. But in Whitefeather's sinful heart, suffering is the opposite of goodness. There's some kind of holiness in this place, though. The miracle that saved her brother when he was near death, that happened in this church. When she's in the woods, religion is the blackbird calling. It's sister trees, wild winds, little blue moths that skip over weeds down by the river, each with their own spirit. What is prayer but thankfulness for ancestors and animals, for morning sun? In this religion, spirit animals guide you. The singing comes from whippoorwills, from beetles clicking in tree bark, and leaves rustling in wind, from the soft clatter of raindrops. And that's all I'll share from this book.
Oh, thank you so much, Ginny. That was really powerful. Erin says this is a fascinating story that I hadn't heard before. And she has a question that we'll ask you in a minute. So I wanted to say that some of you might need to leave. We usually start at 4 and go until 5:30. That's Pacific time. So we did start a little bit late. So if you can stay a little bit late, that would be wonderful. But it's not obviously not mandatory. Um, so Ginny, let me start with Erin's question. Uh, let's see, how did you come upon this story and what compelled you to write such beautiful poems about it?
How did I come across this story? This story is fairly well known in history, the story of the raid at Deerfield, because so many people were captured and so much destruction was done. And I thought, well, that was kind of interesting. And then I started looking into it a little bit. And I found that many of the adults who were captured, if they survived the journey, were redeemed eventually, or a ransom was paid for them. But many of the children were brought into families, generally Mohawk families. There were a few that were brought into French Canadian families. And the children tended to adapt very well to their changed circumstances, and especially girls. And the setup in the Mohawk communities was kind of more favorable to girls and women than the strict Puritan surroundings that people like Joanna had been used to. And so I thought, well, that's just a fascinating story, but I wonder how it felt, to the people involved. And I wonder how some of these children were able to make such a huge leap from one culture to another. And that's a leap that people still have to make today when they immigrate from one culture and are immersed in a totally new culture. And so I decided to try to write about it. And I found, I looked into lists of who had been captured and what had happened to them as far as people knew. And Joanna Kellogg was just at an interesting age, I thought, where she was not an adult, but she was old enough to have some interesting thoughts and to have some resistance to this new culture, but young enough to be more adaptable than some and to have a certain sweetness and naivety. So she's the one I chose to write about. There have been some things written about the minister's daughter, Eunice Williams. It was also brought to Ganawaki. She was a little younger than Joanna. And the minister and his wife and a couple of their kids were captured. Mrs. Williams died along the way. And only Eunice, the youngest surviving child, went to Ganawaki. A couple of others went elsewhere. But the minister was eventually redeemed, and he tried several times to get Eunice back. But by the time he was attempting that, she was well integrated into her family, her new family. Didn't want to leave. They didn't want to give her up. So he did some writings, and there's some writings out there about Reverend Williams and his daughter Eunice, but there's not much about Joanna. But Joseph, her brother, does come into some written history, because when he was a young man, excuse me, he served as a guide on a big trip out past the Mississippi River. And he was very good at languages, and so he served as not as a guide, an interpreter. And he later helped correct some maps that people had. And that's written history. He eventually, as an adult, went back to the colonies. So that's the long answer to that short question.
That's really, really good to know. It's so interesting. And I think, as Erin is saying, most of us don't, unless you're a history buff. I can speak for myself, it just wasn't something I knew that much about. And also we were talking about this beforehand, that, just all the war that was going on before the Revolutionary War, and how the British settlers were really disrupting the indigenous people, and just a lot of turmoil. So I was thinking about that your story about Joanna, there's also all the turmoil that was happening for the people who were living here when the settlers came, and were being forced into a different culture. So it's a beautiful, it's such a good topic. And I'm just thinking about, well, if anyone has any questions or comments, please, I'll say this, and then I hope that people will join in. So the style of these two books couldn't be more different. And I think it's beautiful to see them side by side, to hear you reading side by side. And Ginny, you were telling me that you were a teacher, you're a retired teacher, and you taught the 11-year-olds. Is that right?
Well, I taught I taught different levels, but for a long time I taught 12 and 13-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that age group pretty well.
Yeah.
They're at a wonderful age. They're so changeable.
And so you write this from the point of view of the girl, and also the style of the writing is for young adults, which I think it just fits so beautifully. So, and I see, Richard, you have a comment. So unmute. Yeah, don't forget to unmute. Or a question.
Unmute. Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Jenny. I like the way you serve the song, as they say. You're not trying to get in the way of the history that you're describing. The reader is not impeded by language that's gussied up and unnecessarily stylistic.
Yeah.
I think this the story is important, of course, and also at this point in history, where as a country we are at this moment coming after the midterms and going into another election 2 years from now, redefining who we are as a country, and then revising that redefinition. It's something that we really need to be doing. at this particular moment in history. So I just wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts about this sort of revisionist history and how it can help us perhaps define ourselves more accurately as a nation?
Well, you can't see a human being when you're seeing someone who's an enemy. And that goes for fellow Americans that people see as enemies because they are so wrong. No, they're so wrong. No, they're so wrong. And we stopped seeing other people's humanity. And I think it's when you get into individual stories that you can get past that. And the experiences of these children who were treated so kindly by the Mohawks, even after the terrible events of the raid, where many people were killed and houses were burned down and things were stolen. And it's the same thing, to learn that people are people, and we have to be able to get into other people's skins to understand that. And the whole immigration thing, and as there's more and more climate change, I think is going to affect immigration too across the world. And people are scared of others who are different or who might threaten them in some way. And that's been going on forever.
Mhm.
But individual stories, individuals, they make it more human.
Yeah,
I
Elaine.
look for the
thank you.
human in history. I look for the humanity in history.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, Elaine, you have a
I
comment?
think, yeah, I think both of your readings tonight are so contemporary. Richard, I think there's not a more poignant time where we're redefining work and where people are actually, because they were forced to work or not to work under COVID, but there was just enough time that actually it started shifting values in our country, and people are rethinking what they want out of work. And it's not just the middle class who are rethinking this. And women have left the workforce in a way that people are barely talking about. And because of, the murders that became silhouetted and people began to talk about race, I mean, people are rethinking how they're treated. So I just think it's beautiful what you've done. And I think it's profoundly timely. And Ginny, I love your book. I mean, I just kept reading it again and again. And I have some questions for you. One is, how did you
Oops.
succeed in not comparing or having one culture be better than another? Because it's no small thing to be taken prisoner and then become part of that culture. And yet you don't play on that very much, so that she is able to transform and live in this other culture, though her brother goes back. Even though he was so facile and had languages, he ends up going back. So one is how, I'm interested in how you sort of juggled the cultures, and because you don't seem to overstate or show priority or romanticize one over another. So I'm interested in that. And then metaphorically, you take us through the journey that was real, but you're also a writer going through this as a journey and learning as you go. So I'm interested in what surprised you in this as you were learning it, what you were not expecting, and what you had to grapple with as a writer when you were doing this.
Oh, those are interesting questions. The first question, I have Joanna and Joseph in some conversations in some poems, kind of questioning, what does it mean to be a savage? What does it mean to be this or that? And looking at the different sides. And that's one of the ways I tried to deal with, the pluses and minuses in both cultures. Not enough to do it justice, but I didn't want to present either culture as terrible, just different. what surprised me along the way was one of the things that surprised me was that studies of captives showed that the ones who adapted the best were young girls. I wasn't expecting that, but then, I learned that it was a fairly matrilineal society, where the chiefs were men, but they were chosen by women. And the child care practices were very liberal, very relaxed, which was totally different from the Puritan upbringing. I mean, there was love in both, cultures, but expressed somewhat differently. So yeah, it was definitely a learning experience. It was interesting. I visited Deerfield and I visited Ganawaki, which is still there. And that was interesting too. But
And you tell us the story of how she actually doesn't end up marrying who they want her to marry. I mean, you brought in sort of, I wouldn't call it exactly feminist principles in the middle of this, but she got support from the women there at the end of the day to do something not okay, and where there might actually be repercussions. That was interesting that you put that in.
I had to put some tension in there somewhere,
Yeah, I thought it was great. Yeah.
Have all been wonderful.
So is that something you thought up yourself, or?
I know that she married within the community, but I don't know much about how that went. So yeah, I made stuff up to make it interesting.
Yeah, that was beautiful. I thought it really added to the story. It was beautiful. Yeah, this is a book that, once you start it, you're going to want to read through it. I think both of them are that way, actually. Oh, thank you so much for your really, really amazing questions, Elaine. And does anyone else? Oh, actually, there's something in the chat. Let me read that, unless somebody wants to. I'll start with, so Lauren Cole, that's Richard's wife, I think. She says, I just, so glad to get a comment from you. I just finished reading Ginny's book. I loved it. And I loved how you brought us into this young woman's mind. Clearly you were channeling and brought us along in more of a cinematic experience. And I think that's some of the poetry, I think young people would really appreciate this level of communication. Bravo. And then she adds, I'd love to see what you could write about age and death. That's very interesting.
I definitely was doing some channeling there, because when I get into writing and it's going well, I'm channeling something and I don't know quite where it comes from. But then after I channel, I have to improve it a bit. Love to see what you could write about age and death. I do have some poems about that. They're just not in this particular book. Every poet, they live long enough, can't avoid those topics.
Yeah, those are hot topics, especially.
Yeah, they're part of the human experience, and can't really avoid them. I guess, the fact that we're mortal makes our lives more precious, but it seems like a hard bargain sometimes. And one of the things Richard had said about totaling up our looking at our hopes and subtracting our losses, something like that. That seemed to me like that's what we do in life. We have our hopes and we focus on them, but along the way there have to be losses, and we take those into account also. I think Richard's work is really timely, as Elaine was saying, even especially as things are changing a lot about work. People are evaluating the place of work in our lives and the cost of certain kinds of work. But, we don't all have a trust fund. So
Yeah. Well, so I just want to, I'd like to say a few words about the poetry and the craft, because I think it's, we're talking about some pretty wonderful stuff. So does anybody want to comment on that? I certainly could say a few things. Does anybody? Let me go ahead, and if you want, you can chime in. I can't see the chat right now, so so yeah, I wanted to say I was noticing Richard, some of Richard's first lines and many of Ginny's images, so that are so clear, precise, and really beautiful. Like Richard, you were saying, like what was the word you were using for Ginny's images? There's not much. It it they're very direct, and they really fit with the story and the narrative. Is that what you were saying?
Well, I never assume anybody's going to read beyond the first line if the first line doesn't, pull the reader in. So
Mm,
I guess the lack of assumptions, not taking the reader uh, for granted. In writer groups, they talk about having the ideal reader, and I guess mine is sort of like, the person who likes to read books. But I always felt like ideally we need three kinds of readers when we're working and revising. And one is like your Aunt Clara or your mom, and she loves everything that you write. And we're human
mhm,
beings. We need that. We need that sort of unconditional acceptance.
mm,
And then the second one is maybe a peer, in a writers group, who's has a balanced understanding of what you're trying to do and can give you good points and how to revise it and so forth another. And then I think the third ideal reader um, is somebody who really doesn't like your work at all and doesn't even like you. So
Wow.
you don't want to hang around that person all the time, but still, I think it's healthy for me to remember that that first line really has to be approaching somebody who would prefer not to be reading me or knowing anything about me, nobody me at all. It's a sort of little spice that you have in your reading group. So I always try to work hard on not only the first lines but the titles as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the last line's in the middle too. So yeah,
Hmm.
just to say, so here's a few of your first lines that I collected. Um, and I what you said is it's you really have achieved that. It's the feeling of "Oh, I really want to read this poem. How could I not read this poem after this line?" So, for instance, in the dark, everyone is kind. And that's just like, okay, I want to know more about that. The next one I picked out, perhaps in heaven the blind will still be blind, the lame won't talk, the deformed will not be otherwise, and it won't make a difference. That's like, yeah, and I'll read one more. The one about the middle manager. I have walked down the silent corporate hallways deep in the belly. Yeah, in the belly. Yeah, it's just so.
Yeah, the belly of the beast.
Yeah, but you don't have to say of the beast. We all
Yeah,
know it's the beast, right? That's the beauty of poetry.
that's
And
the
indeed,
craft there too,
the craft,
knowing
yes,
what to put in and what to leave out.
right. And so for you, in yours, some of these descriptions, when you say she is no place, she is no one, she is a stomach clenching. The personification there, I just love. When white feather sleeps, words tumble into her dreams, crooked stars falling from her new sky. Um, but sometimes in a journey, the rapids come on unexpected. you have to plunge through and hope to make it past the boulders and the churning, though you don't know up from down, water from air. And that, yeah, that's very universal, isn't it? I think, yeah, we could say even with COVID, it's like that, you know, just trying to hang on. So, so let's see if there's any other comments or questions. And if, and then when we get past that, I'll read another poem and we'll finish up. Does anybody else want to take a chance to say something? Or oh, Myrna. Can you unmute? There you are.
A little trouble unmuting. I wonder if it's an omen here. What I liked very much, I was struck by a certain universality of appreciation of our endeavors. I'm talking about Richard's poems now. You have tackled a subject, a theme that is not really all that often found in poetry. But because of your craft and because of the turns of phrases and very deep appreciation of how mundane things can become poetic and exciting, you have made me understand that they can be so. It's the last subject in the world that I would admire, frankly, and that's a tick-tocking of a thread that announces ups and downs of stocks. Frankly, it turns me off every time. But I can see how even that can be incredibly exciting. And then I thought at the time when I was working as a computer programmer, and I tried to explain to my friends and my family how incredibly poetic that core work can be, which people don't expect. And by extension, it seems to me that in the right hands and with the right imagination, almost every human effort can become exciting and poetic. I just wanted to.
Oh, how beautiful. What a wonderful way to end our reading conversation tonight. That makes me want to go write a poem about, I don't know, the garbage truck or something. Thank you.
I used to live in Minnesota. And that's a very flat prairie, you know, in that part of the country, upper Midwest. And there was a photographer, I can't remember his name, who photographed that terrain. And somebody asked him, you know, it's awfully flat out there around Mankato and Fargo and so forth and other. Isn't it kind of boring as a subject? And he said, boring is where you're not paying attention.
Yeah.
You just look at it long enough and it starts to get really interesting. So much if it's just paying attention, keeping our eyes open, our hearts open, and things emerge.
Yes.
It's a great mantra for any poet, writer, artist.
And a very, yes, exactly. A beautiful thought. And so to pause on, and so I'm going to read a poem and just to end. And also I want to thank everybody so much for coming and thank Ginny and Richard so much. It was really wonderful, a wonderful reading. And next time won't be until the end of January. So I hope everybody has a terrific Thanksgiving and Christmas. And we have two amazing, Diane Frank and Mary Kay Rummel are going to read in January. So the poem that I chose to take us out with is it is about an older working woman. I wonder who that could be. Narrative poem. That's why I chose it. Trying to decide whether to go to a poetry reading or the gym. And the poem is called Missing Out. Last night it was between Maggie Nelson, MacArthur Genius Award winner, genre-bending poet reading live. It was between the sublime Maggie and the gym. The gym that embraces my sagging muscles, its mindless machines working me. Thoughts erased in drudgery of the treadmill. Sound of many feet hitting rubber tracks. I'm just back from Hawaii and that sauna, my opiate on a chilly night, message of heat and sweat. So easy to mess up my schedule, an overripe banana left out on the counter too long. So hard to choose, decide, follow the peel as it ricochets off the floor, or follow the yellow fruit melted in my hand. My apologies to Maggie, who didn't miss me. I'll never know how she looked when she read that poem I so hoped to hear about green, how she was surrounded, gagged, clefted, appled by it after a year of planning to write a book about blue. If I had time, if life didn't feel so grilled by age, if, I would read that one. I think of her so beautiful in front of the group at Stanford. Everyone so impossibly smart and young. The dress she wore, its color, her face as it went from serious to grin. I would see myself being there. Thank you. Thanks everybody so much, and hope to see you all soon.